Welcome to a podcast brought to you by the American Academy of Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapists. Our academy is a national organization committed to excellence in orthopedic manual physical therapy practice, education, and research, and we're here to explore a wide range of topics with you through interviews with content experts.
Hello, my name is Shaffer, and I'm one of your co-hosts for the AAMPT podcast. Today I'm excited to bring to you an interview with Sarah Sturman. Sarah is a physiotherapist with extensive experience in orthopedics, which she gained while working with the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. After working in more traditional outpatient settings, Sarah transitioned in 2014 to begin working with a persistent pain management team. Then, in 2017, she began a clinical academic internship with the National Institute of Health Research and Health Education England. The internship that she completed resulted in a systematic review, which is going to be the topic of our discussion today. That review was published in the Journal of Bodywork and Movement Therapies and was titled, "Is There a Dose-Response Relationship Between Soft Tissue Manual Therapy and Clinical Outcomes in Fibromyalgia?" Don't know about you, but dosage of manual therapy is one of my favorite topics, so I'm excited to see where this conversation leads us. And with that as our starting point, let's avoid any further delays and see what Sarah has to say. Sarah, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I feel very happy to be here, and it's a nice, bright, sunny day outside, so all is good. Thank you, Stephen.
Well, we are excited to have you here, and I think this is going to be a spectacular conversation. Why don't we just dive right in? And I know I mentioned a little bit of this in the introduction in terms of where the project came from, but can you talk to us about how this project was created and, how it came into existence?
Yeah, well, as you said in your kind introduction, I've worked as a jobbing physio for many years with in the musculoskeletal clinics, dealing with anything from wrist pain to back pain to neck pain. And throughout my career, I would be constantly going on training courses, trying to pick up the next manual therapy strategy or technique, always feeling that I was basically not very good at it. I could never feel what I was supposed to be feeling. I always felt that I wasn't getting the outcomes with my patients I wanted. But yet just spending time with patients, talking to them and doing my best as a hands-on manual therapist, I knew that there was some sort of therapy or some sort of magic in just the act of putting your hands on someone and aiming to increase their health and well-being. And so I struggled with this for many, many years, basically just feeling like I wasn't particularly doing my job very well, but knowing that I could help people get better, but I couldn't really explain why. And over the years, there's been lots of sort of press releases in the manual therapy world as well, which has sort of one by one removed some of our mechanical explanatory models. And this made me feel even more concerned. So it got to a point where I felt that myself and many of my colleagues as physios, we were basically putting our hands in our pockets and saying, I'm not going to touch a patient anymore. I'll show them exercise. I'll talk about their pathology. But really, I'm just going to put my hands in my pockets because nothing about hands-on therapy is trustworthy, nor is it evidence-based. And I was seeing this happening everywhere, but yet my patients were still asking for hands-on therapy. Fast forward to when I moved into a persistent pain service, things became even more difficult because in persistent pain, our approach is that we are trying to encourage self-empowerment in our patients. We want our patients to look after their own well-being and not rely on what would be claimed as passive treatments. And all manual therapies fell under that category of passive treatment. So the team that I joined, our official commissioning state was that we were a hands-off service. And I felt very conflicted as a manual therapist who didn't always trust her manual therapy skills. I was a bit ambivalent about many of the techniques I used, but as I've said, I knew that patients liked hands-on therapy, and sometimes something magical happened when you put your hands on a patient. In my sort of exploration of all things hands-on to try and find an explanatory model or perhaps a technique that would suit me better, I came across the Bowen therapy technique and I trained in it. And although it gave me a technique which I found worked for a lot of patients, it just made the conundrum all the more confusing because the explanatory models for why Bowen therapy has the impact it does on patients, really there were no mechanical models that explained the impact. So I was in this real conundrum of thinking I want to put my hands on patients, but officially I'm not allowed to in my job role. The mechanical understanding, the postural structural model, as Lederman calls it, had been sort of ripped to pieces in the physio press. And I thought, well, the only way I'm going to be able to fathom this whole conundrum out is to do some research. So having been a working physiotherapist for many years, I decided to apply for the clinical academic internship that you mentioned, which was a funded 6-month program where a clinician could just start putting their toes in the water of research, learn some skills from which they could build and become an academic, a clinical academic. And I thought perhaps this was a way I would be able to finally get to the bottom of what are the underlying mechanics of hands-on therapies, and why is it that hands-on therapies can have such a huge impact on our patients' health if it isn't, in fact, supported by any kind of biomechanical or structural model. And so that's sort of where my big question came from. What is it we're doing when we're putting our hands on patients? Why do they sometimes get better? And if we knew, or if we could come up with another explanatory model, perhaps we could make those techniques more efficient. In starting the internship, I had this big, huge question. And in 6 months, obviously, I was encouraged to really whittle that huge area of potential research down into just one itty-bitty tiny question that would allow me to complete some form of research in such a short time as 6 months. So after many false attempts at various questions, trying to look at narrative reviews and systematic reviews, I finally sort of crafted this question of looking at dose-response relationships and their relationship to clinical outcomes in fibromyalgia, because it was an area that had sort of been missed out, I felt. There'd been lots of work looking at manual therapy mechanics, and a narrative review was just too big of a project to tackle in 6 months. But I thought to really bring back the question of manual therapy onto the table for all of us physios who had been starting to put our hands in our pockets, almost afraid to touch our patients, we had to just raise the issue of manual therapy again, and looking at some of the evidence that was around that had been used for systematic reviews that had been conducted previously. One of the things that I just kept being amazed at, really, was the heterogeneity of the dosing protocols. And I felt that if we could look at dosing protocols and suggest that without any consistency, that may be really the downfall of all of our manual therapy and clinical research, we could then sort of reopen the case and say, manual therapy needs looking at again, because up until this point, the research looking at clinical outcomes has been done in a non-systematic way, and perhaps that's why we're getting such poor results. So that's probably a very long answer to your simple question, but sort of taking you from where I was as a clinician, why the move into research, and how this sort of final review question came about.
It is a long answer, but I think it's a very good answer, and it's a very appropriate answer. As a matter of fact, as a physiotherapist, and more specifically a manual physiotherapist, your explanation, not surprisingly, very much mirrors my experience as well. On this end of things, I sometimes have felt like the profession, for example, has abandoned manual therapy too quickly. And like you, I've noticed the lack of consistency in the parameters in the available evidence. So it's always caused me to have this huge question mark in terms of what should we be doing? What is the right dosage? Why are so many people maybe erroneously concluding that manual therapy shouldn't be utilized? And, my bias being pointed out right now, I use manual therapy a lot on this patient population, which is probably one of the reasons why I got excited when I saw your manuscript. And if we could just go back before continuing with the questions that I already had mapped out, I'm curious, you used the term bone therapy, which is a new one for me. I'm not quite sure what you mean when you say bone therapy, and I would take the hint from all of the educators I had in grade school. If I have that question, I'm sure some of our audience does as well. Can you take a moment and describe to us what you mean when you say bone therapy?
Yep. So it may be my accent. It's Bowen,
Oh,
Bowen. So it's one of the lesser known manual therapies, and here in the UK, it's being taught as a fascial treatment. It originated in Australia with Tom Bowen, and as I say, it's very little known. And I literally came across it by chance when I was sort of pouring the internet trying to answer my own questions about what else is it that we can do as a manual therapist when we touch someone and we want to use our therapeutic touch to good effect. So I literally stumbled across this therapy. It's not something that is commonly done within the physiotherapy profession, but I found it, I trained in it, and I was utterly surprised by the responses I was getting from patients. So I definitely recommend for people to look up Bowen therapy and maybe consider incorporating that into their toolbox.
well, that sounds great. And I'm going to guess that it's more my ears and lack of familiarity with Bowen therapy than so much your accent. But thank you for that clarification. And for the next question, I'd like to point out that you very wisely and I think eloquently point out in the introduction of your paper that the condition we've come to call fibromyalgia is in fact quite enigmatic. And bearing that in mind, how is it that you think we should define or perhaps think about fibromyalgia?
It's such a difficult condition to try and wrap up in one definition, and I'm often doing this when working with patients. I participate in a lot of patient education groups, and they want that one little takeaway phrase that explains the condition for themselves and to give to family, friends, employers. And I think it's something that we will keep coming back to as the years go by and reworking our definition. But for my mind, the best description would be to say that fibromyalgia is a system wide maladaptation of our threat detect and response program. So that may well incorporate our central nervous system, our peripheral nervous system, our immune system, really a systems wide conglomeration of the organism being able to read their environment, their external environment, as well as their internal environment, constantly surveying that space for any potential threat, be it chemical, mechanical, emotional, any form of physical threat, really. And once that threat has been detected, being able to sort of orchestrate those protective, defensive programs that the body has at its disposal, whether we're looking at behavior change of the individual, whether we're looking at an immune response, whether we're looking at social withdrawal, so many sort of system-wide changes. And when those changes are used appropriately, as an organism, we are able to thrive. But when those threat detection systems are hyper-vigilant, and when those threat protective programs are aggressive, we manifest sickness behaviours. So to me, that would be the one sort of description, that it's system-wide and it's a maladaptation. The detection of threat is often hypervigilant. The response to threat is obviously very aggressive and can manifest in physical changes, in immunological changes, and in behavioural changes. And really, so the list goes on. Cognitive changes, emotional changes. The body-wide system is influenced by this misperception of environmental threat and an aggressive response.
That's a great description, and it's very consistent with how I see this diagnosis as well. But one of the problems that I've had I guess this is the melding of my clinical brain and my clinical experience with the content that I read in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and that is I have some difficulty with reconciling the differences between how we understand this phenomenon in the research world compared to in clinical practice. Can you speak for a moment about the difficulties when we look at those two different realms and how we define or perhaps interact with fibromyalgia?
Yes, I mean, I think anyone who knows anything about fibromyalgia will know that there are no gold standard diagnostic tests. It's a diagnosis often by exclusion. And in the research world, we're looking at absolutes. So to use a clinical diagnosis in research is fraught with difficulty because no two fibromyalgia patients will be the same. But obviously, for any sort of academic research work, you're looking at reducing the possible confounding variables as much as you can. But with a condition like fibromyalgia, that's so difficult because, just going back to the definition, any kind of system-wide adaptation or maladaptation could obviously manifest itself in so many different ways. So I think having very sort of loose diagnosis when we're working clinically can be helpful because we can then really draw together a lot of the symptoms that our patients present with and put those under these more sort of simple, broad definitions of having this body-wide protective system that's aggressively trying to protect you. I think a very loose term such as that for clinical use really gives our patients a home. Whereas in the academic and research world, we obviously need to be much more specific, but without those gold standard sort of biomarkers, that's a very difficult thing to do. One of the models that I used clinically is the Highland model. So this has been drawn up by a health psychologist in Plymouth in the UK. And he's put together a very beautiful analogy for understanding the sort of precursors to the development of fibromyalgia and also creating a very nice model that actually every single patient that I've used it with, they've been able to say, yeah, this man knows me. This describes my health and what's happened to my health in the last 10 years. And it also creates the sort of the exit strategies for people. In other words, a pathway to recovery. And the Highland model describes a very sort of a loose description of fibromyalgia. It doesn't get caught up in the sort of nitty gritty of those biomarkers that we sometimes see in academic research. So we don't have to get too caught up in, are your cortisol levels too high or too low? What's happening with your HPA axis? What about your adrenal glands? So sort of bypassing some of those mechanical biological steps and again, just taking this system-wide approach. I think the Highland model works very well for clinicians to give themselves a working model, and it works brilliantly with patients. It's much harder when you move it across into the academic research world because we're then working with sort of absolutes, and I just don't think that that's a happy relationship with a condition like fibromyalgia.
Well, that sounds like a great resource, and I can certainly put a link in the show notes so that our audience can find more easily the Highland model in case, for example, they're not familiar with it already. But moving on, I would like to turn to a quote from your manuscript, and I'm going to read it here for the audience. And I'd love to get your expanded thoughts on that particular sentence. And it reads, afferent input to the central nervous system via touch modalities can provide the stimulus for positive bioplastic adaptation in the central nervous system. And when I read that quote, it just really spoke to me in terms of this overall topic that we're talking about and the evidence that you were looking for. So can you expand on that a little bit and tell me what that sentence, for example, means to you in terms of your clinical practice?
Certainly, yeah. It's again a very wordy sentence, and it was trying to incorporate all of those elements that I felt were really important. So we sometimes describe fibromyalgia as a central sensitivity disorder. So I don't think there's any disagreement out there that the central nervous system has a huge role to play in fibromyalgia and perhaps in many other persistent health conditions. So we know that the central nervous system has authority to control so many of the inner workings of the body, that if we're looking at opportunities for healing, we need the central nervous system to be involved. So any kind of healing modality, including any manual therapy, needs to be in some way picked up by the central nervous system, which obviously, having touch applied to the skin, the central nervous system is going to hear about it. But what we're aiming to do with our touch intervention or any other intervention is to provide the central nervous system with some form of stimulus that can be used to facilitate a move towards homeostasis. So with all interventions, I would suggest that what we're doing as clinicians is we're offering up some form of stimuli, some form of data to that person's nervous system. We're saying, hey, look over here. I want you to draw your attention here to what's going on in the muscular system. I'm going to draw your focus here by my putting on of hands. And really, the rest is going to be up to the central nervous system, whether the central nervous system sees that intervention as something threatening and thereby maybe creating an appropriate response, which could be muscle spasm. So when our patients walk out after our well planned out manipulations and they walk out saying, well, I feel worse than when I walked in, maybe that's the central nervous system receiving that stimuli, evaluating it as being threatening in some way, and then creating a protective response, something like muscle spasm. So we are obviously wanting to provide the nervous system with a stimuli of manual therapy, with hands-on touch, and we're trying to create the salutogenic environment. So everything about our encounter with that patient, the clinic setup, the way we are talking to that patient, the temperature of our hands, we're wanting the context of that intervention to be as health enhancing as we can, so that the central nervous system can take that input and evaluate the meaning of that input and facilitate some form of positive adaptation at that central nervous system level. I hope that answers the question.
It most certainly does, and I think it's a very eloquent way of describing and expanding upon that sentence. And it very much fits in with how I'm thinking clinically when I work with a patient, and also what I describe or, educate the patient by saying, because I want them to understand, for example, what I'm doing or what I think I'm doing clinically, so that they can hopefully witness and experience the improvement associated with those hands-on techniques. Now that we have that general understanding of the overall background concepts, I'd like to dive a little bit further into the manuscript and, in particular, table number 1 of the research study. In that table, you lay out the search strategies that were involved when looking at the different terms, etc., for this research project. Can you speak to how you arrived at that search strategy, as well as why you felt you needed such a broad list of different terminology as it related to the topic at hand?
So over the years, I think fibromyalgia has been known by some different labels, and I think also there are many other conditions which share many similarities in clinical presentation to fibromyalgia. So I wanted to make sure that I used enough of the terms to perhaps catch some of the research that may not be in the sort of the mainstream medical journals. I really wanted to make sure that I spread my net as wide as I could to really have a wealth of information to dive into to hopefully get some good answers. So from the diagnostic labelling, I really tried to look at as many versions of fibromyalgia and similar terms as was possible, really. In terms of the search for the manual therapy, similarly, I felt that within manual therapy research, there has been probably the area that's been researched more than any other has been the term massage. But obviously, there are so many other forms of applying touch therapies. As I've said, Bowen therapy was one of those techniques that for me really catapulted me into thinking much more about how we use manual therapy. And I felt that there were probably small little pieces of research looking at these less familiar techniques. And I wanted to make sure that I brought them all together, because the different techniques, whether we're talking about chiropractic manipulations, whether we're talking about Swedish massage, whether we're talking about manual lymphatic drainage, they all belong to, if you like, separate categories where they have their own versions of explanatory models describing why they think what they do works. And I really wanted to, again, sort of be quite non-judgmental about the style of hands-on therapy, but just bring it all together so that we could say, putting your hands on a patient in a clinical reasoned, caring way, despite the specifics of the modality, could all be having some form of shared pathway to success. So I really wanted to, again, bring together as many different research articles as I could. And knowing that often with systematic reviews, you end up with a huge number of articles in your initial trawl. And by the time you cut things out due to problems with methodology or other elements, you're left with quite a small pool of research articles to use. So I really wanted to spread my initial net as widely as I could.
To me, that sounds like a very wise strategy. And of course, we want to acquire all of the relevant evidence so that we can try to come to as robust or solid of a conclusion as possible. And with that wonderful introduction to the search strategy, can you talk to us about which studies or how many studies were actually identified in terms of the overall search and the way it was implemented?
So initially, we came up with 4,012 articles. And as I said, once you go through your initial trawl of articles and you look at quality, removing any duplicates, those that aren't written in English, it worked out that we were left with just 16 articles for the final review.
And what was the quality of those final papers that were included in the project?
So we used the Pedro score for quality, and of the main 12 articles that we took through for final review, 11 of those 12 scored equal to or higher than 6, which counts as high quality on the Pedro rating. Obviously, with all manual therapy studies, it's very hard, if not impossible, to blind your subjects or your clinicians. So they all obviously get doctor mark for lack of blinding. But actually, as I say, 11 of the 12 main articles were considered high quality on the Pedro score.
In the beginning of this conversation, one of the things that you said was that you wanted to get to the bottom of the question, the research question that you had in mind. So now that you've developed the search and you implemented that search, have you gotten to the bottom of the question you were looking at? And if I were to state that differently, I would ask you, having combed through all of that evidence, what is it that we can currently say about manual therapy and its actual or potential impacts on a diagnosis like fibromyalgia?
I was quite concerned at the beginning of this project that I would put a lot of work and time in, which I did, and end up with no new information to share, or perhaps worse still, that I would just be confirming my worst fears that actually manual therapy is a waste of time for fibromyalgia patients, according to the published literature. So I was quite surprised when, at the end of the review, I was able to say there's strong evidence that manual therapy is effective. Now, the reason I found that very surprising is that the articles I was reviewing were the very same articles that were cropping up in the literature published alongside national guidelines for fibromyalgia care. So I was hugely surprised that I could be reading these articles using a quality tool like the Pedro score and rating these articles as good quality, high quality, and that the summary was manual therapy is effective, and yet these same articles were being quoted in the guidelines, where the guidelines were evaluating all manual therapy to be passive. I think one of the guidelines referred to it in inverted commas as a magic pill treatment. And so it was a surprise. It was reassuring that I was able to show good, solid evidence of positive effect through manual therapy. My actual question of looking for a strong dose response relationship, from that perspective, there were no consistent dose response relationships that I could find, which didn't surprise me. And I think partly, again, that came down to a small number of final articles review with huge discrepancies between those articles as to their dosing parameters. So I felt my mission was complete in that I was able to sort of put manual therapy back on the table as something that should be there, that deserves its place in ongoing discussions of clinical guidelines for fibromyalgia. The primary research is showing that there is positive effect with manual therapy. So we need to be behind that. We need to be doing more research that is able to start constructing clearer dosing protocols so that we can then start to see those improved clinical outcomes and hopefully stand behind our profession proudly with our hands out of our pockets and being able to offer this form of treatment maybe as part of a multi-component package rather than as a standalone treatment. But that certainly the research did confirm that manual therapy does have a positive impact, and not only on pain, which is obviously the primary symptom that commonly brings patients to our clinic door, but in fact on many of the other really important symptoms that our fibromyalgia patients are suffering with. So sleep disturbance, cognitive problems, stiffness, emotional difficulties, relationship difficulties. Many of these other things were referenced in these articles, and I was able to look at the sort of the main domains that came out of the OMERACT trials. So looking at pain, mood, sleep, and quality of life as those main sort of four big hitting symptoms. And manual therapy in all of the studies I reviewed was shown to be effective in all of those clinical outcome groups.
The findings of your research are very consistent with what I find clinically. And, just as a personal / professional observation, I find that the recommendations have always been very quick to say that manual therapy is not the best way forward. And I'm certainly not going to argue that manual therapy is the only thing we should do with this patient population. But I have found clinically that if I take my time, if I increase the dosage, if I ease the patient in from more gentle to more aggressive techniques, and then, yes, of course, couple that with patient education, a home program, aerobic exercise, etc., I find that the manual therapy adds a very valuable component. And I use that time to talk about the pain science, to educate the patient, because I'm trying to get at their central nervous system, both by using my hands and stimulating the system from the periphery, but also with my words, so that cognitively I can help the patient understand and positively impact their central nervous system. So perhaps that's why when I saw the published paper, I was so excited about it. And, this little, I don't know, maybe professional version of myself in my head started jumping up and down saying, yes, we need some more research going down this path, because I think people are just too quick to dismiss manual therapy with this patient population.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's only with this patient population. I think there was a reference from Lau et al. In 2017, I think, and they were talking about the polarization within physical therapy of the sort of pain neuroscience education physios who are getting very excited, as well they should, about lots of the developments in neuroscience. But with that excitement in understanding the brain and neuroscience, there's almost been the permission to, as I say, put our hands in our pockets. It's all hands off. It's explaining the central nervous system. It's all about top-down processing versus the category of manual therapists who are the staunch manual therapists. It's hands-on patients. There's no pain neuroscience education at all. And this sort of polarization to me it just seems incredible. It's not in the service of any of our patients to have these two aspects of healthcare being separated, that the bringing together of good top-down cognitive education about pain neuroscience alongside the embodied experience of hands-on therapy alongside exercise and other perhaps behavioural change, to me is treating the whole person. And it's, as I say, I don't think this is solely when we're talking about the fibromyalgia patient group. This is just an across the board separation of the physical therapist into the hands-on and the hands-off brigade. So it's great that there are other people who are also thinking about bringing these two sides together and doing the sort of the top-down interventions alongside the bottom-up interventions. To me, it makes sense that we're then treating the whole person with as many tools that we have in our toolbox and not sort of doing this either or approach.
Having participated in and now completed this research project, if you were to construct a take-home message for physiotherapists around the world regarding the usage of manual therapy with patients that have this type of central processing, let's call it abnormality, what would that take-home message be for physiotherapists?
I think any form of manual therapy has the potential to be very potent. Now, that could be potentially very helpful to our patient when we create the correct context. But equally, we need to be careful, I guess, that if we're not getting the context right, if we're describing ourselves as being some form of body mechanic that's going to fix that person can just be that passive recipient that the guidelines warn us of, then that can be potentially very harmful where the person has no ownership over their own health. So I think the message really is that we as a professional group, we have license to put our hands on people. And there are so many other professional groups out there who do not have that license. And so we need to protect that license, but we also need to continue to understand the mechanics of our tools more deeply so that we can support the ongoing delivery of manual therapy services to our patients. And so that we can, by understanding the role that manual therapy has to play, put it into a package of care that really meets the need of every individual that walks into our clinic.
I think that was a very spectacular summary of the overall message and importance. And to be blunt about it, I'm just so excited that professionals such as yourself are out there doing this type of work. I hope other people pick up on this general theme so that in a year or 5 years or 10, that we can continue to expand our understanding of what is going on in terms of the interface between manual therapy and the central nervous system. And speaking of which, do you, at the present moment, have any current or future projects that you're looking forward to maybe implementing on this topic or other topics?
Yeah, absolutely. At the sort of the beginning of my clinical academic internship, as I said, I had to sort of do a bit of a workaround to get my final systematic review question. But the areas that I was interested in, as you say, were this sort of interface between manual therapy and the central nervous system. And in particular, I've been very interested for many years in the work of Steve Porges and the polyvagal theory. I wasn't able to bring that into this particular systematic review, but it is something that I'm working on at the moment. As I say, I work in a persistent pain team, and we have currently patient programs that we run for those people with fibromyalgia, and they are based on the gold standard cognitive behavioural therapy and exercise from the physios. So what we're looking at doing is reviewing the use of the Safe and Sound protocol, which is an audio intervention, digitally created music, which has been designed to facilitate a move in a person's homeostasis. So really sort of hacking in, I guess, to the polyvagal system to create a shift in that person's physiology. And my feeling was that for a lot of people with fibromyalgia, the stress of the disorder, perhaps the stress of life outside of the disorder, can take them to a point where their body is just not able to manage any kind of stress loading. And actually, as the polyvagal theory tells us, once somebody has reached that point, really their nervous system goes into a sort of a mode of shutdown. So when we're using the gold standard cognitive approaches and behavioural therapies, oftentimes individuals just do not have the capacity to make changes to their behaviour or to really engage in any of these cognitive interventions. So my feeling was that the Safe and Sound protocol could be a really valuable preparatory intervention to help move a person into a more socially engaged state, and that may enhance their abilities to engage in a behavioural program. So this is something that we're sort of mapping out right now. Much of the planning for this had to be put on hold with the pandemic, as much of the world's research, particularly health research, has been put on hold when all research efforts have gone towards understanding the pandemic and the best ways to get out of it. So this is a project that got sort of started maybe 18 months ago. It's been on hold for a long time, but we're just starting to put things back into position now. So maybe in another year from now, we'll have something to publish.
Well, that sounds like a truly intriguing line of research, and I, for one, will be very much looking forward to the end product of those projects. And as we close out, let me just say it has been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you for all of the work that you do, both clinically and in the realm of research. It is because of people such as yourself that our profession is moving forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. I guess the idea for any clinician of delving into the world of research is that you feel passionate about raising something to the wider consciousness of the physio community. So thank you for this opportunity.
This has been a production of the American Academy of Orthopedic Manual Physical Therapists. You can learn more about the Academy by visiting our website at aaompt.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram by searching for our acronym, AAOMPT. The views and opinions expressed on the AOMPT podcast are those of the interviewers and interviewees and do not represent the official position of AOMPT. The information presented should not be used as personal healthcare or clinical practice advice. If you need to find an expert orthopedic physical therapist near you, then check out the Find a Fellow feature under the Public Resources tab at www.aaompt.org, which you can find in the show notes.